All righty. Thank you, friends, for tuning in. This is uh, a time wherein I will contemplate the Tao of Philip Lamantia. Um, it will be the fruits of my study of his work and my attention to his presence on the page and in person, and of course, in my consciousness, in my thought also. And so I want to convey the teaching of the poet as the touch of the marvelous in this way. And I also want to express great gratitude to all those in the poetic community of the Bay Area and around the world who have contributed to the drawing out from the mass of Philip Lamantia's productions and putting them together in ways that fit the needs of the forms, in the ways that fit like the needs of the volumes, the collected volumes, the selected volumes, the individual books, the assorted other forms of writing, the prose, and also the awareness of being in the living presence is so much a key part of how the the magic or the inspiration of the word is conveyed, how that informs their selection of the material. So it's like I see it as an example, when I have access to these books that I've studied, Preserving Fire, Selected Prose, Philip Lamantia's collected poems, the Book of Interviews, the individual books, Becoming Visible, Meadow Lark West, the selected poems, Bed of Sphinxes, all of these, they represent, a loving selection. And so it communicates to me along those lines as I become more aware of it, because there are so many ways that surrealism and these various pursuits and disciplines and descriptions of the style and the way of life, the Tao, the manifestation from within of the life course of Philip Lamantia, the weird, all of these words that I'm using, they represent schools of thought, movements and histories, but they also represent concepts and ways our fragmentary lives are made to become sensible wholes, conceptually, poetically, in the real way. And so it's it's enormous, of course, But so I guess I will start out with some of his own words. We'll see what's here in this particular one. I'll tell you the title first. It's called Song for the Intellect. I would like to read that to you, but before I do, actually, I want to properly do this, by starting at the end. In Preserving Fire, there's a statement Philip Lamantia makes, it's on page 149, and he made the statement July 24th, 2001. And it's a statement. It is called a statement. So, let's start with that. Maybe we can look at it like that. Okay. Here's the statement. As with Poe and Milton, passion is qualified as the central sun of poetry. Indeed, analogously, the human and suprahuman erotic, the active and creative principle, attains infinite degrees of transformational power. Poetry has yet to recover its function as a conductor vehicle of essential knowledge, gnosis. Passionate love is the lever of the poet and saint, androgynous union, source and culmination in renewal of vital energy. Designated the Magnificent by André Breton, the symbolist poet Saint Paul Roux reminds us poetry is nothing less than the renewal of God's original activity. It is a traditional saying, hermetic. The root of heaven is on earth. Saint Catherine of Siena, desire is infinite. By analogy to the above triad, I suggest the past is in the future. Furthermore, mystery illuminates the marvelous in all things, and surreality inhabits the marvelous mystery at the core of all and any reality. So what a rich statement that is. I love to contemplate it. One reason is I am freed, faced with the message of this, of having to worry about how it stacks up as a work of art, as a work of language art for myself. Why? Because the conceptual content is one with the form. It's prose, then, you might say. Usable in that way, workable, And, but so one thing, though, I want to say, though, it's also exhortational. The most exhortational passage here to me at this moment in time is where he says, poetry has yet to recover its function as a conductor, vehicle of essential knowledge. It has yet. After all these ages, poetry has yet to recover its function as a conductor, vehicle of essential knowledge. Okay, poetry is the conductor. Poetry is the vehicle. Okay? I've mentioned the selection and the love in the selection of the work done by the poetic community and gathering together the writings of Lamantia. And that aspect of it, of the work, of the poetic work, I'm reminded of Ursula Le Guin's The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, where Ursula Le Guin, a California artist, teaches that we're so used to thinking of the essential instrument that makes for adventure or meaning, the meaning given to an event worthy of being recounted has to do with weapons of triumph and of the hunt and all of this. But we are still learning to understand that the essential form of the story, the essential form of the way that knowledge and understanding is passed down from age to age is analogous to the carrier bag, the container that we put things in, be it the seeds that we gather, or be it, our young, when we need to take them with us when we go out to gather the seeds or to do the work in the fields, the cradle, things we make. These are all carrier bags, containers or holders. The book is such a carrier bag, I would say. And so as Ursula Le Guin teaches us what we are learning about the true nature of the function of the form of literature in its mythical conceptual sense, Philip Lamantia's statement about poetry and the recovery of its true nature to our consciousness is as a conductor and vehicle of essential knowledge, or gnosis. Gnosis, knowledge, a conductor and a vehicle, a transmitter than a wavelength, you see. And poetry is nothing less than the renewal of God's original activity. The language arts are cognitive arts, and the form that they take appears in the as something in the energy, in the mental and in the mental and imaginative energy, which in and of itself has no size, no shape, no weight, no mass, and yet it has infinite substance. But we understand it in no other way except conceptually. And so terms like conduit, conductor, transmission, wavelength, all of these things are proper analogous terms, because words, of course, fall back as it approaches certain silent truths. Song for the intellect, then, to have another, to move closer to another perspective on the domain of mind that I'm contemplating now. Let's hear from Philip Lamantia in this poem called Song for the Intellect. Mere poets are playing in gardens of the sky arch, meats, herbs, O tree of living bread, O bread of the spirit. I die down in aromatics, resins, weaving bushes, fruits, out of the desert into seascapes of sky, suns of no name, your heart of heaven carved in memory, left open to the darts of gnosis. In crucifixions, my mad mouth whirls pleasures of the south, driving to your north. In my west, these smokes of cool summer rise in the east. My fingers point 3 to the infinite. 1 is a womb. What goes out of me as smoke weaves these words. I'm pointing to you always, Lord of living light. I'm drifting, cut to the quick of borning places. I'm firm in your absolute, asymmetric, sempiternal order. For others, I wish they make it. Sadness covers the earth. You are poured forth like sap of lightning, balms of grace, superior resins. I am in and out. Your kingdom comes. So that's Song for the Intellect. And you see many, many different directions woven, units of 3, his 3 fingers, units of Trinitarian triadic, units of 4, the 4 directions. I think when he's talking about the directions here, he is speaking of the distinctions that we make in our emotional self between intention and expectation and our perception of our movement, both in and out of space. All of those things. Crucifixions means so many things. Cross. Fiction, it also means. I want to read that middle section then again. In crucifixions, my mad mouth whirls pleasures of the south. driving to your north. In my west, these smokes of cool summer rise in the east. My fingers point 3 to the infinite. 1 is a womb. What goes out of me as smoke weaves these words. I'm pointing to you always, Lord of living light. I'm drifting, cut to the quick of borning places. I'm firm in your absolute asymmetric, semi-paternal order. So it's a 3-strand weave. The smoke weaves the words, phenomenal atmospheric manifestations that take the form of changing tendrils, seemingly random like clouds. I'm pointing to you always. That's the intention, pointing to you always, Lord of living light. I'm drifting, pointing, also drifting, cut to the quick of borning places. I'm firm in your absolute asymmetric sempiternal order. Firm. Now, I think sempiternal, that's a word that I think that Berkeley Renaissance, San Francisco Renaissance poets, that has a certain really lovely meaning. I think that's like from, there was that great body of work by that medievalist, I think his name was Kantorowicz, who taught at UC Berkeley. And he was a medievalist, and so he taught lines of succession and the subtleties of lines of successions of thrones of kingship and of these aristocratic, invisible kind of charisms of order. And it was spoken in such a way that I think for the poets who were inspired by that, it helped them to understand this missing link between forms of economic structure and forms of government, both archaic forms of government and quote unquote modern forms of government or social organization, including economics. Well, lines of succession. How is the commission? How is the gift, the commission, the bond, the mission? How is it passed down through generations? Sempiternal, I think that has to do with like down through time in a certain kind of way. And so, speaking of sempiternal classifications of poetic value in relation to spirituality and other poetic themes, I want to bring in something else to weave in this Taoist view of the intellect of Philip Lamantia's poetic gift to us. Let me see. I'll refer to this. This is San Francisco Beat, Talking with the Poets, edited by David Meltzer. These beautiful interviews with some of these poets at this time. And Lamantia, and this is part of his nature as a teacher, Lamantia had this reputation, as a very difficult kind of interview, because the way that he would express his thoughts, they would like, it was like these exfoliating, labyrinthian waves of transmission, yes, of thought, and all delivered in this inimitable and sonorous and somewhat mannered kind of like Mediterranean tidewater kind of accent, uniquely his own, and with a very rich and a variable kind of timbre. Sometimes it was very baritone, and other times it would be whispery, and other times it would be reedy in a certain way. And I think that the poetics of action, the poetics of acting, I think that's an important doorway, I think, for us to look at another aspect of Lamantia. But for some reason, I also want to mention old-time stage actors like Sarah Bernhardt, who had much to teach about the nature of just the invisible. She didn't use the word nervous system, but the subtle and speechless energies involved in conveying theatrical speech in such a way as to move the audience. And this is somehow instinctive, I think, in some of the bearing, of Philip Lamantia. There's a certain kind of like classical decorum, about many aspects of his voice and presence, which I think can be studied, and you can find connections to all forms of other art and all other forms of history of art. It's just the nature of this kind of personality, or with this kind of gift, I should say. And but now, yes, he is asked by David Meltzer in this interview in the late 1990s, 1998, I guess. Philip Lamantia is asked this question: would you say that poets are at the forefront of this fusion of spiritual practices? Before they were talking about Buddhism and Christianity. And Lamantia was saying that, caritas, caring, charity, caritas, the Latin word, is in Catholicism. It has, it is of one nature with, the universal bodhisattva, the desire to enlighten all without distinctions of merit, this kind of universal love, caritas. Also, Philip Lamantia helps us to understand other ancient classical concepts like eros, the erotic or the god of love, but there's also all the variations of that and the ways that we come to understand it in our inheritance as human beings from the arts and from theology and religions, poetically conceived of, from mysticism, all the ancient cultural traditions of gnosis embedded in the inner vibrations of these words like eros, agape, selfless love, eros, the kind of love that overpowers you in the specificness of the form, the sensual form in which you are in relation to the other. It's endless. I'm speaking of it so generally, but anyway, they're talking about this, and they're connecting this to the Christianity and Buddhism, Catholicism. Philip Lamantia worked all his life to bring together these seemingly, contradictory movements or schools of thought, surrealism and Catholicism, this kind of thing. And so it's an ongoing theme when you study the expressions of his thought. But anyway, so David Meltzer asked him, would you say the poets are at the forefront of this fusion of spiritual practices? He's talking about, the whole ecumenical thing. Remember that back in those days? To bring together the inner qualities of the religion so that all could mutually be enriched on the path toward truth in whatever way one conceived of it. Many pathways to the garden, right? Well, anyway, here's what Philip Lamantia said. When I first met the great Nicaraguan poet Ernesto Cardenal in 1961 on a retreat in the Cuernavaca Benedictine Monastery, he was doing basic yoga exercises recommended by a French Dominican in The Yogi of Christ. I think that's a book titled, The Yogi of Christ. Then, says Philip Lamantia, through Vatican II, an ecumenical opening was made to various Asian religions. Thomas Merton had already found Zen Buddhism. Recently, I came across an interesting exchange between two priests, one Taoist and the other Catholic, in The Tao of Jesus. That's a book written by a San Francisco Episcopalian priest. Came out sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. The Tao of Jesus. And anyway, I came across an interesting exchange between two priests, one Taoist and the other Catholic, in the Tao of Jesus. And the Dalai Lama's sympathetic reflections on Christianity have recently been published. Then there are the spiritual, mystical, experiential connections. Contemplation for us is analogous to Buddhist meditation. It tends to a perfectly centered, imageless state of awareness. This can inspire poetry. So Marina Lazara asked, so poetry is? Ah, said Philip Lamantia, poetry is the mean term between the physical basis for imaginary and the metaphysical realm of being. Poetry is the mean term between the physical basis for imagery and the metaphysical realm of being. This is what connects the affective to the cerebral, the heart to the sensual, and the mental vehicles of reception to the visible and invisible realms of being. In fact, poetry creates or recreates these mediations in the experience of those who are ready to receive it. In that sense, we are all poets. In the same way, one could say that all are potential supra-beings, beings to be deified, as the Eastern Orthodox Church puts it. And then David Meltzer, who studied Kabbalah, said, the Spanish Kabbalist Abulafia said that everyone is his own Messiah. And Philip Lamantia said, well, this I can understand within a hierarchic structure which exists in both the Eastern and the Western wings of the Church, and which you can see in the 5th or 6th century writings of Pseudo-Dionysius. His mystical theology is the basis for the apophatic path. I believe that apophatic path is one of the two paths of mysticism. Apophatic means neti, in Sanskrit. Not this. The path of like purification of images of the divine. You approach the nature of God, which is inconceivable. So how can concepts do anything but mislead? Well, you become present to the stream of the different concepts, and then you see why it is not this, and it is not this, and it is not this, and it's purification. Apophatic. Cataphatic, on the other hand, is you study the images of the divine and come to know them as images of the divine. You see, one is the image is a conduit, poetry, and the other is the receptive mode of mind, which can create the conditions of poetry, so for the poet, if that's your gift, And so these are these two aspects of the mystical path that they are referring to in just the natural flow of the conversation. That's why we can study it this way. It's so important that it's put down so that we can read it aloud and come to think of it now, for me. Anyway, St. Thomas Aquinas referred to this short treatise by Pseudo-Dionysius, a Neoplatonic mystic, St. Thomas Aquinas referred to this short treatise as the supreme authority for all that which surpasses the rational apprehension of reality. And then David Meltzer asks, can the poem say the unsayable? And Philip Lamantia answers with a question. Isn't this what poets have always aspired to? Seemingly failing in the attempt, but finally achieving a miracle in words? As a poet, can you say you don't know? Asked David Meltzer. Philip Lamantia answered, not consciously, no, I don't believe so. Not consciously, he says, I cannot say I don't know. So you see, it's important to realize it's not like it's when we say it's apophatic or it's purging away the rational or seeing the futility of rational speech and approaching, what we really want to convey. It's not. It doesn't mean then that abandon rationality and then it's not that. Well, it is that, but it doesn't mean it's not this, not rational, neither anti-rational, not this. So he's saying, consciously, even a surrealist cannot not know what he writes. That's what he's saying. Or he says, I don't believe so. And this is the big contribution of surrealism. The surrealists worked in what Freud called the unconscious. Of course, their practice did not entail the abandonment of the conscious. For poetry, only rational control and preconceived aesthetic and moral determinations were ultimately rejected. The exploration was like a voyage in uncharted seas, and you could be shipwrecked along the way in a psychological sense. And then David Milster says, the poet is a voyager. And then they talked about Lamantia's travels. And he did travel at a certain time in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Lamantia's travels. Let me mention that, and then I want to see if I can come back to this other thing. Lamantia's legend, his social legend, so to speak, why we know him, or why, a fanboy, such as myself, might, some years ago, after while reading Meadowlark West, I think while reading the poem America in the Age of Gold, and seeing images referring to the expanding luminosity in Thomas Cole's Hudson River Valley paintings, and that experience in art of the natural sublime, the sublime in the old sense, well, hardly, but seeing we'd all been born in a half-savage country, out of date, bent resolutely on ringing lilies from the acorn. I'm only saying that just as a spare quotation from another great poet of the Periplum times, against whom Lamantia would often, dialogue harshly in history. And I just kind of quoted from Hugh Selwyn Moberly about Ezra Pound, written by Ezra Pound. And you could look at Lamantia and Ezra Pound as being sort of diametrically opposed in a certain way, because over time Lamantia, as internationally traveled as he was in a specific way, not like Ezra Pound, well, not in the same way. No, I mean, both of these poets assimilated European tradition into their own idiosyncratic American tongue, but with different views of society and culture. Well, yeah, of course, and different ways that manifested in history, and so there's Lamantia is resolutely faithful to the Christian radical pacifist poetic left wing, the West Coast thing, the spirit of that, whereas Ezra Pound was cosmopolitan, crusty, idiosyncratic, curmudgeonly, obsessed and cranky, and circumstances involving absorption into crank economic theories and thoughts, and warped idealism about the nature of the banking system in Renaissance times caused Ezra Pound, who lived in Italy at the time and was very cosmopolitan in his way, of course, to become enraptured with the whole phenomenon of Italian fascism and Mussolini and all this, and he ended up, as this is the story, it's important to put it here now, I suppose, because one of the things that Ezra Pound did, who fell away, into fascism and all of this, in this world crisis, which Lamantia came of age under. I'm talking about the Second World War, of course. Lamantia, for a long time, several years during the war, gave these radio broadcasts over Italian radio where he could talk about whatever it was he wanted to talk about. And he, in his own inimitable, manic kind of way, he spoke of so many things, but it included a lot of anti-Semitic vitriol and a lot of crank economical ideas, which caused a lot of wheels to spin that do spin out there in the world consciousness, and then he paid for his sufferings. He barely escaped the death penalty, and he spent some 12 years, imprisoned in Pisa, where he wrote the Pisan cantos, and then 12 or some odd years in St. Elizabeth's, the same place John Hinckley was, I think, in Washington, D.C., before they let him out, and then he came back and lived the rest of his life in Italy. He might have visited the United States once or twice, but there's this terrible ambiguity. People like Ezra Pound and Heidegger and others, but not so Philip Lamantia, no, from all the way through, even amidst, the problematic politics, of the Surrealist movement as it came to be formed in Europe, in France especially, he was discovered, quote unquote, he was hailed by Andre Breton as a voice that rises once every 100 years. I'm talking about Philip Lamantia now. He was hailed by if Andre Breton says that you're great, wow, what more assurance do you need? And he heard this when he was just a kid. He was a teenager. So there's that prodigy aspect of him, And like Rimbaud in another poetic myth, he was discovered from the time as a teenager. So we're talking now about Philip Lamantia's poetic formation. We got there when David Meltzer asked him about, or began to direct the interview into the mention of Philip Lamantia's travels. Let me just say the countries that he lived in. Mexico, Greece, Tangier, Algiers, Morocco, Spain, Italy, on that southern European Mediterranean side of things, I have to say, and that's noteworthy. But those are his travels later on as an adult. But his first travel were when as a teenager, before he'd even graduated high school, he lit out for New York from San Francisco. Philip Lamantia was born in 1927, same year as my mother. He came home from the hospital, or I don't know if he was born in the hospital or not. It was in 1927, and they lived just over here at I don't remember on Sanchez Street, and but then while still an infant, they moved out to the Excelsior in San Francisco. Of course, his mother and father were Sicilians, and they were produce merchants, and they were quite successful. His maternal uncle, I think, had even a place in the Santa Cruz Hills where they were invited to spend their summers. That's where they spent the great strike, the general strike in San Francisco in 1934. Philip would have been 7 or 8 or something like that, and he remembers his parents and his relatives, as being upset by this, but he himself, he was exploring the woods, and feeling the strength and the beauty in nature and these kind of like visitations, he would have exploring, in Santa Cruz and also in the Excelsior district and on San Bruno Mountain, and when he was a kid. And he said one of his first poetic experiences, very formative, and this is in the selected prose of Philip Lamantia, if I can find it for you. Let me read you his words about that. I am of Sicilian parentage, born 1927 in San Francisco, California, near the 17th century Spanish foundations of Mission Dolores. My first poetic hallucination ecstasy occurred when I identified in a cradle the word light with the electric bulb above my head. I have a clearly engraved image of this initiatory event from which my poetic life seems to proceed. Identified the word light with the electric bulb above my head. Now, it's a lot of things. Light, means so much, but the electric light now, to my mind, it's more specific, and this is, it is a certain kind of like opening of language formation, but it involves an image of the intellect, and a bright artificial light on a tender consciousness. And yet the tender consciousness knows this is what is happening. How? By the magic meaning, the magic of the meaning, the energy of the meaning of the word light, which is a word for energy, but it's in this mediated human form. So that gives me pause, to think about this. Then, he writes, then came an early fever vision, before the age of 7, in the apparition of a radiating blue-gowned woman from the door of a bedroom closet. When I was 15, a page of my poems appeared in the magazine called View, across from E. E. Cummings on another page. So he got published in View, which was a well-known magazine in New York at that time. View magazine, and of course VVV. That was Andre Breton in the Surrealist diaspora. Yves Tanguy, many of the Surrealists were in New York. They managed to escape, the chaos in Europe. And so it was the Surrealist diaspora. They established the magazine VVV, and also this magazine View, in which the teenager Philip Lamantia, in the hinterlands of San Francisco, that's what it was thought of back then, was published, in these magazines, and was given such a benediction by Andre Breton that he abandoned high school and came to New York and lived on his own for some period of time, and worked as an intern in some of these magazines, and got to see and know some of these people. He only was with or hung out with Andre Breton, I think, just 3 times. I could be wrong about that, but it was a different kind of benediction, that came, and these things become part of the legend of the poet, in these times, and it's for us to understand, and for the poet to bear the workings out of in their own fate, So it's exemplary in a certain sense. Anyway, so he says, this is before that. This is before he was famous. There was the attraction to beauty. Attracted by the strange beauty of Poe's poetry, that's Edgar Allan, I had, for almost a year, written a vast amount of poems, but it was not until my chance encounter with surrealism that I seriously considered myself a poet. Not long after discovering View, I learned of the authentic organ of surrealism in America, the magazine called VVV, 3 capital V's, VVV, whose editorial advisors were Andre Breton, Max Ernst, and Marcel Duchamp. I sent poems, and Breton agreed to publish them, but requested a letter from me clarifying my position to surrealism. When published in the last issue of VVV, this letter bore the title, Surrealism in 1943. It was a peculiarly prophetic testament to my later divergent development and, I'm happy to say now, my ultimate return to surreality since 1966, when I began the arduous and exciting attempt at purely automatic writing as defined by Breton in his Manifestos of Surrealism of 1924 and 1929. And so then he talks about later in this particular rendition of his legendary career, he talks later about something of a break with surrealism after coming back from New York and back in San Francisco. I think it was like it was during the war when he was in New York, and then he was back in San Francisco for the end of the war, I think, and then for some years in the late 1940s, and that was where he became connected with the living, radical Christian, anarchist, pacifist style of thought in San Francisco at that time, along with the great figure of Kenneth Rexroth, who, like Lamantia, in the way that I'm, presenting Lamantia to you now, like Lamantia was a kind of a poetic teacher and just this vast educational presence, And so Lamantia, after seeing and rubbing shoulders with, to whatever degree in New York, I think it was difficult for him in New York. I think the basic things like where to live and everything. He was just a kid, he was 17 or something like this, Anyway, back in San Francisco, he was back on his home territory, so to speak, his home, but he was nurtured and fell in with and became part of that community of anarchists, syndicalists, all kinds of old time European socialists, pacifists, Christians, Tolstoyan Christians. The kingdom of God is within you, and it supersedes the authorities of principalities and powers, and it's peace, and it's long suffering, and it's giving, and it creates a whole pacifist tradition, anti-war tradition. And what a beautiful time that it could still exist, because the war had been won, and now America was in this other kind of space, as this kind of privileged kind of like pinnacle of its fortune, and yet there were those who knew the shadow side of that in so many ways, of course. And one of the ways that they tried to make it conscious, it was through the disciplines of art and the sublime thought, and expressions, cultural expressions. And so they had these pacifist journals, these poetic journals, and Kenneth Rexroth, who came from the Midwest, and he too has a great self-invented kind of person legend and a very unique way of talking. Lamantia's, Tidewater, Mediterranean, Englishified thing, which Jack Kerouac sort of, when I read it, made fun of in his fictionalized account of the Sixth reading, where Howell was first read. Lamantia was one of the readers at that, because he was more well-established than Allen Ginsberg was, and some of the others who read at the Sixth Gallery, which becomes in the story, in the way it is told, this legendary launching point. And for us, we don't have to take it literally in that way. We can just look at it and come to identify certain works of literature and their relation to their times through studying, these legends. Lamantia, by this time, that was 1955. That's 10 years after what I'm talking about now. So let me go back to the late 40s. This is the nucleus of the San Francisco Renaissance, as they called it, before the Beat Generation and all this. Robert Duncan, William Everson, who later became Brother Antoninus, the Dominican poet, priest, monk, and then later rejected that and became a bear claw necklace-wearing shaman on the wild edges of California, and a great teacher in Santa Cruz. Well, these were their early days, and around them was and Kantorowicz, the people at UC Berkeley, who were inspired by some of what they were learning there, Jack Spicer, Robin Blazer, and then many others, this is part of the canon, right, of what we're looking at here, and this is why we're studying Lamantia, but I'm trying to reach into more of the inner content of it, of course, rather than just the fame. But it is important to note that Lamantia, who was, like I say, he was already known in New York from his work with the Surrealists, and he was already established in the San Francisco Renaissance before it was called that, And so, as Michael McClure said, we all looked to Philip. He was an established presence as a reader at the Sixth Gallery, and he read not his own poems, but the poems of John Hoffman, who was a peer of Philip Lamantia's and a dear friend and a great poet and very young, and traveled, inspired by Lautréamont and the underground poet figures and Rimbaud, of course, and all those things. He went to Uruguay, Montevideo, and also Mexico, and is said to have died, of some, malady, some fever or something. And Philip Lamantia read some of the poems of John Hoffman at the Sixth Gallery reading in October of 1955, I think the same place that Allen Ginsberg debuted his landmark poem, Howl. And these writings, as you can tell by the faint description of them, them giving, now you see how they were, they arose out of this communal poetic milieu, and this gave them some of these themes, and it gave them a certain style and a certain kind of vernacular and a certain kind of shared tradition of learning, and also of creative innovation and a style and all of this. And so, of course, this is when we study poetry, we can study this aspect of it if it still, beckons to us. And, it's there's so many things to understand, right? And we know so very few. But Lamantia went on from there. After that, when it began to get famous, the whole beatnik thing, I think that was when Lamantia was already in points abroad, in Mexico and in Europe, Morocco. I think he had already been in Mexico, where he followed in the footsteps of Artaud, loosely saying that insofar as let me tell you some of that in Lamantia's own words here, once again from the book of interviews here, if I can find it, with Philip Lamantia, where Lamantia talks about some of the places that he went to and what he did there and experienced there, and the meaning of these things in relation to his unfolding, inspired poetic understanding, which goes on and on now, in our own consciousness. So he went and he was with the Cora Indians in Mexico, not the Tarahumara that Artaud was with, 20-ish years before the war. Artaud was with the Tarahumara looking for the peyote ceremony, and Lamantia experienced something analogous with the Cora Native Americans in Mexico. James Brooks asks Philip Lamantia, was it Artaud's writings that brought you to the Indians? Partly, says Philip Lamantia. I had read Artaud's Journey to the Land of the Tarahumaras in 1948, and then I lived in one of Jaime de Angulo's houses for 6 months in the Berkeley Hills in the early 50s. Although Jaime was no longer alive. The house was a Mabeck-built beauty. Mabeck was the architect in Berkeley. The house was a Mabeck-built beauty, and I remember it was there that I read Karl Lumholtz's Unknown Mexico about the Nayere with whom Lumholtz had spent 5 years. They also had a peyote rite. David Meltzer says, let's talk about the nature of the ceremony or the ritual that you went through. Can you describe the point of their ritual? What did the ritual lead to? Philip Lamantia explains and kind of relates a nice little story. There's also poetic descriptions or poetic poems where this is also the subject matter in his collected poems. But here he relates as an anecdote in conversation. It was a sacramental celebration of Yana, their black, juicy tobacco, not at all like the species we smoke. It's one of the many subgenera originally cultivated in the Americas. The rite, though not in any way Christian, began in the one Jesuit mission church in the village at about 10 o'clock in the evening. First, there was an elaborate ritual handling of a black wooden sculpture representing the elongated figure of a man, which they carried to their mobile, richly designed and feathered wooden altar at the far end of the church, away from the Catholic altar. This black statue of a man was exquisitely carved. After about an hour, we left, and they carried the sculpture in a black box along with the altar and other paraphernalia. The procession was guided by a single file of torch-bearing men up a hill to a place hidden from the view of the village below. We came to the stone-portaled entrance to their temple, on whose lintel the representation of a giant iguana had been carved. I had already seen a living giant iguana basking on rocks near the river of the village, whose Spanish name is Jesus Maria. Once inside the open temple, about 40 seated themselves, a third of them wearing stylized priestly garb of glimmering clothes. On one side of the circle, I remember about 5 of them playing curious-looking bow and string instruments, others playing flutes. And there was an enormous 2-foot-high slab of wood, carefully honed, upon which the people, one at a time, took turns dancing, providing resonant, percussive sounds in unison with the other instruments. This orchestra played some of the greatest music I have ever heard. This went on for about 6 hours until dawn. Musically, I heard compliments to Bach, Mozart, Balinese classical music, which so inspired Artaud, Balinese classical music and Indian ragas. An amazing experience, communal and transcendent. So that too, that informs his sense of the poetic marvelous, and of religious consciousness, and of the way that the people give form to their religious consciousness. And it reminds us, of the syncretism that is a part always of every religion. We are easily led astray if we don't look at it poetically by the gossip which passes for news. Well, yeah, it exists, of course, but about the churches and all the religious structures as just as social manifestations of these different forms of conflict and restricted identities and unfree imaginations, and what a vast human mockery this is. It's part of the collective curse of our culture that this becomes part of our understanding of the world, given to us by the conventional mind at large through the various media and things, including word of mouth, ignorantly relayed. But it is only through the knowledge which one touches on within that one can begin to come to an ever-evolving awareness of the unity of the sacred, of the sublime, of the transcendent, of the marvelous, that provide, the inner conceptual substance, and sometimes the spark, and sometimes the adhesive kind of formal quality of works of art and cultural forms, and kept in the consciousness of the mystic, of the poet, of the saint. Remember in his statement, he talks about passion. And of course, remember that passion means, that word has changed so much over the years, has it not? Passion. It means pain originally. It was originally, it was the time, of Christ's, of Jesus's final hours, the passion, the sacrifice of Christ, the passion. And nowadays, and it's come also, it means so many things, of course, pathos, pain, passion. It also means what we love, enthusiasm, strong feeling. It means all of these things. And when Philip Lamantia, in his statement, talks about passion as the central sun of poetry, indeed, analogously, the human and suprahuman erotic, the active and creative principle, attains infinite degrees of transformational power. Poetry has yet to recover its function as a conductor vehicle of essential knowledge, gnosis. So 2 important concepts, passion and also gnosis. And then, of course, the greatest of all, love, where he says, passionate love is the lever of the poet and the saint, androgynous union, source and culmination in renewal of vital energy. Yes, I wanted to come back to that because the lever of the saint and the poet is passionate love. And passion means pain. Passion means the tribulations of Christ's sacrificial endeavor and work, uniting the human and the divine. It's a way of understanding a poetic truth, And the mystery can be studied, I think, without corrupting us if we gently and thoroughly guided by the teachings of the poets. We can go into the inner houses of these words as they exist in our cognitive minds and come to become aware of their conceptual structure, but also of the energy that suffuses them, which comes from this source which is beyond words, And so then this is essentially, this is an important kind of thing, and we learn how to do this by studying certain kind of works, and I'm representing to you that the works of Philip Lamantia are ways that we can come to that understanding, and lead us to other stories, other recountings, other histories. There are many pathways to the garden, right? That's what is on Philip Lamantia's gravestone. There are many pathways to the garden. And that was a title that he gave to a very early kind of sometimes I want to say conventionally surrealist poem, but the title, is far beyond, the poem in a certain sense. The energy, there's still the self-o'erleaping of the poetic forms, So let me just go on a slightly different kind of thing now. I want to actually do something, if I can, to take this risk about that. And that is, well, first let me check the time. When I say risk, don't get too excited. It's not that. It's just something that to me is kind of strange. Oh, yeah, okay, we're doing all right in terms of time. But I want to talk about this gnosis, passionate love, the lever of the saints and the poets, and knowledge or gnosis, and poetry's long journey to realize itself as the conductor or the conduit of the knowledge of this understanding of this, divine mystery, so to speak, and the nature of that in language. So I would like to share some words with you from another poet, in a certain sense, St. Paul, in his book, his biblical book from 1 Corinthians. And then that will lead to a certain radical expression that Philip Lamantia does in his poems. He did so many radical things all over the place in terms of the sublime and the diabolical. I can only allude to so little. I'm kind of emphasizing, it seems, what I would call the philosophical side of it at this time. But here's another way to understand that. So this is from the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians from St. Paul, from the Bible. Brothers and sisters, I don't want you to be ignorant about spiritual gifts. There are different spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are different ministries, and the same Lord. And there are different activities, but the same God, who produces all of them in every one. A demonstration of the Spirit is given to each person for the common good. A word of wisdom is given by the Spirit to one person, a word of knowledge to another according to the same Spirit, faith to still another by the same Spirit, gifts of healing to another in the same Spirit, in the one Spirit, performance of miracles to another, prophecy to another, the ability to tell spirits apart to another, different kinds of tongues to another, and the interpretation of the tongues to another. All these things are produced by the one and same Spirit, who gives what he wants to each person. You see what I'm talking about now? I'm talking about speaking in tongues. One of the things under the category of spiritual gifts, which are given to each and all for the common good, you know. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's the work of living in this world that is the kind of work that we're talking about, that we are free to talk about by the power of Philip Lamantia's poetry, to liberate our minds so that we can begin to think creatively about God and about language and about words and about praise and about speech and about meaning and about concepts. Anyway, so let me just go on a little bit, and then it'll be a little bit more fun in a moment, maybe. But more biblical passages. Oh, certainly the body isn't one part but many. If the foot says, I'm not part of the body because I'm not a hand, does that mean it's not part of the body? If the ear says, I'm not part of the body because I'm not an eye, does that mean it's not part of the body? If the whole body were an eye, what would happen to the hearing? And if the whole body were an ear, what would happen to the sense of smell? But as God has placed each one of the parts in the body just like he wanted, if all were one and the same body part, what would happen to the body? But as it is, there are many parts, but one body. So it's the corporate wholeness, of the people that he's talking about. This is why when people read this, they understand like the socialist thing, you might say, and they also understand the subtle way that these invisible energies operate in the soul, of human beings. So he goes on and on, but let me just, it's about speaking in tongues. Pursue love. This is after 1 Corinthians 13, where it talks about love. Though I speak with the tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal. That's a lovely thing. But later on, he says some other things too. Pursue love and use your ambition to try to get spiritual gifts, but especially so that you might prophesy. This is because those who speak in a tongue don't speak to people, but to God. No one understands it. They speak mysteries by the Spirit. Those who prophesy speak to people, building them up and giving them encouragement and comfort. People who speak in a tongue build up themselves. Those who prophesy build up the church. I wish that all of you spoke in tongues, but I'd rather you could prophesy. Those who prophesy are more important than those who speak in tongues, unless they're able to interpret them so that the church might be built up. After all, brothers and sisters, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I help you? Unless I speak to you with a revelation, some knowledge, a prophecy, or a teaching. Likewise, things that aren't alive, like a harp or a lyre, can make a sound, but if there aren't different notes in the sounds they make, how will the tune from the harp, or the lyre be recognized? It's the same way with you. If you don't use language that is easy to understand when you speak in a tongue, then how will anyone understand what is said? It will be as if you are speaking to the air. There are probably many language families in the world, and none of them are without meaning. Therefore, those who speak in a tongue should pray to be able to interpret. If I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind isn't productive. What should I do? I'll pray in the spirit, but I'll pray with my mind too. I'll sing a psalm in the spirit, but I'll sing the psalm with my mind too. So this is such to me, it opens a vast and beautiful doors of something that has always been so very familiar somehow to us. So immediately after Song for the Intellect, and this is another thing about the way that these poems are put together in the texts, I want to, immediately after the Song to the Intellect is Philip Lamantia, and he's going to speak in tongues for us in a poem called Babel, but not without some preliminary and very meaningful instructions. So this is his preface to this poem. Or maybe it's part of the poem itself, right? The interpretation of the unknown tongue is a form of prophecy. The unknown tongue, of course, is also a spiritual gift. They both have their place in one body. They're both given to different individuals. This is all part of the weird, of the pattern, of the individual lives. We study people like Lamantia because the course of their life becomes exemplary to us. It's part of the way that they teach. But we will all teach in different ways, and as poets. And this is one of the ways, it's being famous or something. But anyway, but also, could it not be that the interpretation of the tongue is also a tongue in and of itself? Could it not be that the tongue, as a spiritual gift, is a form of prophecy, if only because of its apophatic nature? But is it apophatic or is it cataphatic, the speaking in the tongues? There is a form, is there not? It's the sound, maybe. It's also the physical effort, by the human organism to make words and language. But let's hear what Philip Lamantia has to say in his little prose foreword to this weird poem. Babel is a language extending the sonic level of the poem in pure song flight to maximum points and turned out to further dimensions connotative, denotative languages cannot reach. Babel furthers greater sonic energy output within connotative, denotative writing by work done in heights and depths of lettered sounds. He capitalizes it there. Any poet worth his salt can make Babel poems. It is important to get on to sound level and sound flow, resisting connotative language surging from open absolute sound of letters. My experience in Babel maps a world of sonic trance. An act of abandon to this trance must be made in order to quickly transcribe the sound of it into letters, proceeding directly from it. Spontaneous, immediate transcription. That's also in capital letters. Now, St. Paul, remember, he says, I wish everybody spoke in tongues. And he himself, the gift of tongues comes to him, but it comes to him, St. Paul seems to imply in other passages I haven't read, comes to him not when he's assembled, with the people, because when he says something to the effect of when he's assembled when the people are assembled before him, he has a role, and his role is to uplift and build up the body. And so he says something to the effect of, in his inimitable way, I would rather speak 5 words of prophecy than 1,000,000 words of speaking in tongues if I'm in front of people, St. Paul says. And so sometimes I wonder, is Philip Lamantia, is he trying to understand through the mind of St. Paul when he's telling us this? But he does something else. As a teacher, Philip Lamantia does something else. He interprets it already, and this is how he does this. He talks about getting into the sound flow. He talks about it's an act of abandonment that you make, but for a reason, so that you can transcribe it after, you see. So the abandonment is not really an abandonment now, is it? It's done to affix it into some kind of intelligibility unique and fitting to that form of utterance, the speaking in the tongues. Okay? And so, and then he gives us a little bit of the history of it, and we need to understand this too. And he mentions this poet I don't know of. Sandy Rootman and I originated and named Babel in December 1960 in Mexico City. These first examples of Babel poetry were made in December 1960 and January 1961, closely related to fragmental similar outbursts in my earlier destroyed works from Auerhahn Press in 1961 in spring, and to Antonin Artaud's lost book, Lettura de Efrahi Tali Tetr Fendi Fotia o Forte Indi, Antonin Artaud's lost book of tongues. Also by descending scale of relation to lettrist, gongorist, Dadaist, sound poems. These are schools and styles of poetic utterance down through history. Lettrist, gongorist, Dadaistic sound poems. Wonderful things to study in and of themselves. Certain poems in a Spanish-Latin meld by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, James Joyce, when he wrote In Pure Sounds, Hugo Ball, the Swiss Dadaist or cabaret poet, jazz, scat talk. Further research will reveal Babel's intrinsic tie-in to legendary one language, the Tower of Babel, from the Bible. Babel poetry is immediately communicable. Poets of all tongues, Babel. So this is Babel. Ali ben Buri de Asaliam Paris Kadiskum Shantan Tibulil Dagamuri Sagur Tirti Stanto Raganimu Anta Pastorico Hibil Tuhama Orona Karana Zet Zendefia Upantalu Turi Agenta Lahara Shamanchur Pultinago Napoltanat Shapra Duhaftam Anta Tibila Jibbi Titu Iri Koko Pasar Bashir Upu Singel Damna Tuti Pasaltho Shugawa Daktut Utu Bit Shepan Nan Har Ashuntag Ale Lete Tius Mara Tis Midi Didi Tusigut E Aishai Galama Hurami Shetadil Spuram Kiki Totam Eglanda Ruda Kuma Puti Boe Barcham Soliana Frenega Polers Destin Macha TV Dio di Tepel Comps Insta Machante Fulgul Tubri Opal Dara Urara Turara Senta Kutsmari Otoria Ragonduri Secom Panti Isha Pantawi Impotrex La Luga Mechanda Puspera. So that's Babel. Yeah, that's me reading it now. But what I want to tell you is the interpretation there? The interpretation is there, provided by Lamantia in the prose preface to it, where he speaks of the way to step into the flow of it, to by some kind of trance, and he uses this word trance, as everyone does. It just means kind of like entrainment, being in kind of harmony with a certain kind of vibe, so that the ego is less, the rational ego, the critical ego, I guess, it takes a back seat, steps aside from its hegemony for a while, so that this different kind of energy can come forth more fully. And the exemplary way that this can be manifested is in the phenomenon and also the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues. But it's only one part of the total body, and all the parts working together is how the real work is done, and it happens in time. Time, William Blake says, is the mercy of eternity. Without time, everything would be happening, all at once, and eternally, and yet suddenly, and it wouldn't be, it would be too much for us. And so through the arts of time, which include improvisation and all these other things, we come to bring closer to the desire of our hearts to understand and be creative, and so these are some of the ways, some of the themes that come up to do this. Now I want to just say one thing more, because I know the time is doing this thing. Yes, okay, I know a couple of things I want to do if I can. I'm going to give short shrift to it, but one of the most cogent, lucid, inspiring, and really easy to read and elegantly, flowingly, and yet uniquely constructed according to the way his thought works is this beautiful essay that Philip Lamantia wrote about old-time radio. And I first came across this in one of the Surrealist publications, the Chicago Surrealists in the 1970s. And it was, I found it in a used bookstore, and it was like, whoa, it's called A Child's Bed of Sirens. Let me find it. But it was, in my mind, it was like, I didn't know, I was lucky to come across it and everything, but now, it's made available in this beautiful, The Preserving Fire, the selected prose of Philip Lamantia. And so now I just want to give a smattering of the feeling of what's going on in there and what he's saying. So it's on page 104. So let me turn to that page. I mean, all of this is the labor of reading poetry, the labor of uttering poetry, the labor of being present to poetry, the labor of the meaning of the poetry as it comes to be in us. It's an enormous labor, is it not? But yet it has no mass or weight, you know. You can't touch it, you know. Radio voices, a child's bed of sirens. And note the quote at the beginning. It's a quote from Novalis. Novalis, the great German medieval romantic poet and metallurgist, by the way, and philosopher. Activity is the faculty of receiving. Activity is the faculty of receiving. Are we not also immediately put in mind of John Keats and negative capability? You know, the ability, negative capability, the ability to sustain in mind the understanding of something without the, obsessive and harsh and meddlesome intrusion of the many contradictions. Negative capability, where you take on the coloring of something. That's one of the ways you can look at it, but it's not. Well, it's so many things. It's not just chameleonism, and it's not nullity of oneself. It's not self-abnegation, but it's kind of like poetic selflessness, of being open. And yet activity is the faculty of receiving. And that's, I just want to mention the Tao of Lamantia. One of the ways the Tao of his works is in the balancing of the yins and the yangs, and the yins within the yangs and the yangs within the yins. Activity is the faculty of receiving. And he's quoting Novalis, you know. Anyway, so he talks about American radio. Whatever its limitations, he writes, it was generally acknowledged that American radio between 1920 and 1950 had the virtue of providing a stimulating vehicle, albeit technical, for exercising a listener's imagination. Determined by radio's intrinsic structure, the listener was forced to see, by responsive imaginative activity, the invisible content of what is by contrast given and visualized in movies and television. With adults, such imaginary collaboration may have been, more often than not, confined to what was directly suggested by the broadcasters. But for children, up to the age of puberty, certain radio dramas sparked realms of terror, desire, and reverie, which infinitely improved and heightened the content far beyond the limits set rationally and consciously by the original producers. In some adventures and mystery programs of radio's so-called golden age, I was listening, says Philip Lamantia, born in 1927, I was listening intensively as a child between 1934 and 1942. Radioland was peopled by figures, images, and mythic concepts which served as formidable initiators of poetry and enchantment. I can trace a profound awakening of the poetic sense of life and language directly to the magical myth of the shadow and to those disquieting transgressions, veritable sagas of symbolic patricide and matricide revealed by the Whistler. And then he goes on and on. The daytime shows, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Buck Rogers, Dick Tracy, Jungle Jim, Terry and the Pirates. These were realistic adventure shows, radio shows. But beginning, back to the text now, but beginning in the early evening, the purer mystery fantasies were featured. Fu Manchu, Chandu the Magician, Mandrake the Magician, and the Shadow. Deeper into the night, fantasy fiction came on, Lights Out, and The Witch's Tale, aimed presumably at adults and adolescents, but certainly heard by the more precocious or less disciplined children, by those of us who possessed secret handmade crystal sets or managed to acquire personal bedside radios, dropping off to sleep at least once or twice a week by means of a kind of audio weird tales, the Lovecraftian pulp magazines many of us would not discover until the brink of adolescence, but for which we were being adequately prepared by radio late at night. For those who lived in the western and mountain areas, around 9 or 10 in the evening, radio on Sundays transmitted the long-running series of individual dramas linked by a basic structure fictionalizing heinous crimes of capitalist greed. The Whistler and the Shadow were conceived, no doubt, under the rubric of escapist adult fare, along with the detective adventure groups, which were usually aired at prime time, such as the very sympathetic Alias Jimmy Valentine, based on O. Henry's genial safecracker, and Boston Blackie, both prototypes of the good bad guys, as well as Bulldog Drummond, an exotic lone wolf from England. But what was intended by the radio producers and what occurred in a child's imaginary reception and associational development of the thematic materials from these audio sources were often contradictory, and humorously so, considering the rigorously adhered to serious intentions of the producers and writers behind the formulas. So it goes on and on. Eventually he quotes Gilbert Seldes. This is interesting. He paraphrases Gilbert Seldes. He says, radio is not, in the strict sense, a mass media cultural form. Hence, the dramas were mostly the creation of connoisseurs of certain genre literatures who, representing a minority of the reading public, projected their special interests onto everybody, at least onto whoever was listening, through the evening hours. Anyway, and so then he talks about Chandu, Mandrake the Magician, Fu Manchu, and he begins to talk about magic. These were magical characters, and then he links them up. Philip Lamantia does, and it's very rich. I would love to read you the entire thing in the way that he conveys it, but I can only quickly paraphrase it. He links it up to like the archetypal figures, the magicians, of folk tale and everything, and to the nocturnal audio listening of children who are taking it in and being responsive to it in a way that those who broadcast and convey, the managers of the ratios of broadcasting and the technology of it all, to them it's entertainment and diversion and distraction. But to the sensitive ones listening, it is an entry into worlds of wonder and magic and reverie and danger. And also a manifestation, a demonstration, an example of the way the language of enchantment works, so much so that... and also the subversiveness about, the capitalist world order and law and order as it's conventionally understood, and the way that justice is really helped by these invisible figures and these magical, beings who are righting wrongs, and in this way that is outside the established rational orders, making it all in the age-old way that creative storytelling does to the listening comprehension. London at midnight. A great city wrapped in a heavy shroud of dense yellow fog. Street lights weird as elephant lamps grow mistily as something fashioned in a dream. The murmur of creeping traffic. Behind an ancient wall, a vast gloomy mansion crouches like an evil beast of prey. Foghorn blasts, slow footsteps, gunshot, police whistles. Out of the fog, out of the night, and into his American adventure comes Bulldog Drummond. Ah, yes, and he's what he's doing. He's quoting the various, announcements and opening words of some of these radio dramas, and it's just you understand what he's saying when he talks about it. Most fictional accounts of the modern Magus, from Bulwer Lytton's Zanoni, a seminal popular novel of the Victorian age, to Dr. Strange, in the recent comic book extravaganza have their sources directly and individually in Cagliostro and his more esoteric royalist counterpart, the Count of Saint Germain, who also distinguished himself in the resurgence of magical belief which curiously paralleled the rationalist Enlightenment and the birth of capitalism. In this latter connection, the sociologist Marcel Mauss, who wrote the book upon which Lewis Hyde based his beautiful book called The Gift, about the gift economy, Marcel Mauss, writing in France at the turn of the century, stated in his theory of magic, magical beliefs which are active in certain corners of our society and which were quite general a century ago are the most alive, the most real indicators of a state of social unrest and social consciousness. And isn't that a mouthful? And we know we need to be attuned to the moral sublimities of magical understanding and magical consciousness. And we can't do it being influenced, by the garbage that circulates out there, but we can by training ourselves gently and persistently in the understanding of the magical speech of poetry. And so it goes on, and I know the time has come. Philip Lamantia loved. He told me so. I told him, I called him up. I was reading Meadowlark West, and I saw there was something when he mentioned the energy of the expanding luminosity of Thomas Cole's sublime paintings of the Hudson River Valley School, those great sublime American landscapes. And it was carried and conveyed in some of the reverie, the cascading and rich and dense reverie writing in Meadowlark West, which is so attuned to the history and the landscape of our region here, from which I'm telling you this, that something about it made me pick up the phone and look his number up in the phone book and call him on the telephone. So, and we spoke. He spoke, for hours actually. That call and a few other telephone calls, and eventually I attended church with him down there in North Beach at the St. Francis Shrine, and then we went out and ate in a small Italian restaurant, and he said a few things about his. He would speak in a kind of a way that I knew, it was kind of this shared, I don't know, this generous, imaginative content. That was his function as a teacher. He was there for people, and it wasn't like I felt awkward, in one sense of being like a fanboy in a certain sense, but in another sense, no, man, I'm listening, and this is how we work, within the language arts. We listen and we learn, and we continue to digest it and share it with the community, and so he I'm so grateful for his contribution, and there are others, of course, less well known, who have inspired me also so much, and I think I just want to say that out loud. On that note, but he was glad that I told him my work, I'm a storyteller in an elementary school in Berkeley, and he liked that. And when I read his Bed of Sirens essay about old time radio, I understand, that he understands the poetic value of that. And so he's able to offer me encouragement in that way, which is so simple and yet so priceless. And so we slowly come to understand it. Anyway, so I'll just read a really quick thing now. I know it's time to sign off. I would like to say this one. No, I would like to say this one to you ever so quickly. He wrote, and in his later years, he was working on a collection called Symbolon about the analogical consciousness and everything. And so since I mentioned the Song to the Intellect and the light bulb and speaking in tongues and the conceptual nature of all this, we've kind of seems to have emphasized a lot of the philosophical side. So here is a poem from his collection called Symbolon, called Theoria. And I'm reminded of Gary Snyder's poem, Theoria, Praxis, and Ascesis of the Wild. That's another poem. But this is Theoria by Philip Lamantia. Light, remember, is a shadow casting images through primary colors. faster than thought. Poetry is slower than words. Words are eidetic perceptions of a synthesis of symbolons, things thrown together, these, those, under, snaking by. This last part I want to read again to you. Words are eidetic perceptions of a synthesis of symbolons, things thrown together, these, those, under, snaking by. Eidetic perceptions. Poetry is slower than words. Words are eidetic perceptions of a synthesis of symbolons. Light is a shadow. Faster than thought. Poetry is slower than words. Words are eidetic, E-I-D-E-T-I-C, perceptions of a synthesis of symbolons, things thrown together, these, those, under, snaking by. So it's an outpouring of the old analogic consciousness, the old poetic consciousness. We are restoring the work of poetry to our understanding as part of our inheritance as we come to terms with the demands of our current space-time. And Philip Lamantia, presente. All right, I thank you for your heroic listening, and so long for now.